Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV Whiskey 1 Good Vibrations. Here to talk just a little bit about that antenna that you see behind me, mounted on the deck railing. I've talked about this antenna before. It's designed for 20 meters, but it's 22 feet high. A quarter wavelength is about 16.5 feet on 20 meters, but this is a quarter wavelength vertical, capacitively loaded at the base with a 50 picofarad ceramic capacitor for QRP, 7 watts on PSK and 10 watts on CW, primarily designed for 20 meters, and there's some radials underneath the deck, right underneath my feet as I stand here. So it's a monoband antenna, and it works pretty well. Directly behind me is facing southeast towards South America, and this antenna works pretty well on 20 meters to South America when the band is open, as you might guess. To the northwest of me, that is in the direction I'm facing through my house, there's a hill, and it doesn't work so well, say, for Japan and much of Asia. But that's not to say that it doesn't work at all. The antenna also works, interestingly enough, on frequencies as low as 10 megahertz and all the way up through 28 megahertz band. I've even tried it on 6 meters, the 50 megahertz band from time to time, by simply brute force tuning the input end of a coaxial feed line to this antenna, despite the fact that the SWR on some of these bands is horrendous. I think in some cases upwards of 5 to 1, but because of line loss, the SWR meter only will indicate up to about 8 to 1, and then it just runs flat. I mean, even if I short circuit the line, it'll still say 8 to 1 because of line loss. But I think on some bands, the actual feed point standing wave ratio on this antenna is in excess of 8 to 1. Just horrendous. By all indications, something you'd never even want to attempt. Some people balk at the idea of a 2 to 1 SWR. But if you can tune that SWR down to 1 to 1 at your transceiver by putting a transmatch right at the transceiver point, you're going to have a mighty inefficient feed line, but a mighty efficient antenna, and the transceiver is going to see a 1 to 1 SWR. So the laws of physics, in a way, they can't be defeated, but they can sometimes be outwitted by somebody stupid enough, such as W1GV, yours truly, to try to make contacts on an antenna with a 10 to 1 standing wave ratio on the feed line, which is sort of marginal coaxial cable. It's that thin stuff that's about the size of RG59 physically, but it's supposed to be 50 ohms and some sort of imitation RG8. I forget what that's called, but it's less than perfect, but certainly better than nothing at all. And that's the key. You are guaranteed never to make any contacts by force feeding an antenna like this if you don't try. So I've heard some exotic DX from time to time on bands like 24 megahertz or 28 megahertz when they're open, even 21 megahertz, but that seems to be prone to all sorts of RF in the shack problems, even at QRP levels. It's always been that way. There's a curse on that band. The 15-meter band, for some reason, has a curse on it when it comes to W1GV. The 18 megahertz band, and of course, the band for which the antenna was designed, the 14 megahertz band. and even the 10 megahertz band from time to time. But I particularly like the 24 and 28 megahertz bands, but because despite the absolutely horrendous standing wave ratio on the feed line and the fact that I'm running QRP, which prevents at least excessive voltages and currents from occurring on that feed line, there's one thing that can happen if I try, and that is I can make contacts with this antenna, and I can work DX with this antenna. I've worked some pretty exotic DX with this antenna, and only 7 watts of CW. I just sit there like a mountain lion, crouching, waiting for my prey, waiting for the opportune moment, the moment when nobody is sending, because people are just hesitating for a moment in the pileup. There's always openings like that, even in the worst pileups. And then, through the silence of space, rings out the QRP signal of W1GV from a horrendously inefficient antenna. Just this sound. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da. And wouldn't you know it, as often as not, the exotic DX hears that sound and comes back to me. Stan Gibilisco, signing off, saying 73, which means best regards, and so long, which at the end of any casual contact on CW means da-da-da-da-da-da.